Welcome back to the latest episode of the Flex Success podcast, where we teach you how to be less shit. As always, we will be your co-hosts. I'm Lizzie, and this is Dean.
Now, if you find value in this episode, be sure to give us a like, subscribe, and drop a comment below on YouTube. Share us with your friends, give us a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast app, and if you want to take a screenshot and tag us on Instagram, just do that by putting in @flex_success.
And while you're on Instagram, you can check out everything we offer, from our ebooks to courses and programs. You can book a consultation or inquire about coaching via the link in our bio, or you can do that on our website.
Enjoy the episode.
Welcome back, everybody, to the Flex Success podcast. Today we have another special podcast in that we have a return co-host in George. George, welcome. And today we're both joined by Big Phil from Sport Plus Performance. Mate, thanks for jumping on.
No worries, happy to be here.
We've just had a bit of a discussion before we hit the record button on the importance of deciding whether or not you're a scruncher or a folder on the toilet. And I believe you're a folder, Phil. Tell me the thought behind it.
More space, neater, tighter bundles, all of the things, all the good stuff you want to talk about in public.
How about let's unpack this. No.
Well, the biggest thing is I always think of it like, this to basically to segue into the real conversation we're going to have today. Think about it like a behavior versus a habit, right? So we have these behaviors. Now, behaviors by definition are conscious decisions made based on the situation and environment. A habit is an evolution of that. So behavior, automated behavior, then into habits. So when I ask somebody, an example of what they do autonomously versus through consciousness, they often can't decide. And the first thing I always say to them, hey, listen, how do you clean your teeth? And they start cleaning their teeth in the exact same position every single time. Now, at some point in their life, they decided to start on the top right-hand side in my personal case. So that is a decision that I made at 3 or 4 or 5 years of age. And that's just predicated how I clean my teeth. So the folding conversation is exactly the same thing. At some point in time, I was probably most likely shown by my parents, and that was what I was shown to do. And that just evolved. And now I realize, like I said before, that logically it's bigger space, it's a bigger serving. And I got a big ass, man. I'm a big dude. So like more space is covered.
I don't know if serving is the appropriate word I'd use for wiping my ass, but serving of paper. How many squares?
3. Start at 3, work down to 2. I buy the good shit though, man. The shit's already fucking 4 layers deep.
Mate, Liz, if you are listening to this, my lovely wife and partner, we have many debates over the quality of toilet paper that she chooses not to purchase. She's by no means like money conscious to the point of like skimping on things, but toilet paper is one of those things she always goes for the deal. And I'm like, hey,
nah, drop the dollars.
I need thick paper. I want it to be smooth and soft. But
triple quilted ply, like it's got to be. I've got to see some science on the packaging of like how it's layered.
And you go. I was going to say to your point, Phil, if you get really good quality toilet paper, you need less squares.
Well, there are a couple of things always you never skip on. One is toothpaste. Don't buy black and gold toothpaste is the first thing. Secondly, don't buy shitty toilet paper. And thirdly, don't buy bad soap, because bad soap is just horrible. It's ruined you. And the running joke because my missus pays a effing fortune for skincare, and I wash my face with Dove. And she always says, "Oh, you wash your face with soap." I don't wash my face with soap. I wash my face with Dove with 1 quart of moisturizing cream. I always say the entire ad whenever I explain it to her, because spending a few extra dollars, you want to get it in there. So yeah, it works. It's always kept my skin clean. So there you go.
Well, on this lovely note, mate, we always kick this podcast off for people that don't know you. Phil, who are you? What do you do? And why do you do it?
So my name is Phil Smith. I'm a performance nutritionist. I mainly work with what I deem to be called athletically minded individuals and above. So that means people who sort of tend to live the lifestyle of an athlete, but don't necessarily compete in the chosen sport. We see this a lot in the bodybuilding world, for example. You see it a lot in the CrossFit world. People who might train 1, even 2, or even 3 times a day. They live, let's use the quote unquote clean lifestyle that they do. They choose to drink less and, perform well and all these things, but they don't necessarily enter into competition. That's what I like to call an athletically minded individual. I work with that group of personality and above, right up to professional athletes in the NFL, professional weightlifters, powerlifters, etc. And why do I do it? Because many, many years ago, I made some stupid decisions, and this is my way of giving back to make people better.
Okay. Often, I think some of the greatest athletes and even, I suppose, educators and thought provokers are the way they are because it comes out of something that is potentially painful. So an interesting one, but nice.
I grew up very angry. I grew up like I'm I'm 140 kilos now, so I'm a big dude. But in my teenage years, I was 155 kilos in the wrong direction. So let's say in the less health conscious direction. And I was a very angry teenager. And I used to get very angry very quickly. I threw a couch at a guy, not a chair, a couch, a 2-seater couch as a 16-year-old kid. So I realized that's not a path I want to be on. So I sort of changed my ways and thought back, what do I know about that I can help people with and help them be better? And that's why I do what I do.
Yeah, cool.
I suppose the martial arts for you is a vice from that respect, I guess.
Yeah, I did Taekwondo as a teenager. And then I actually ended up with really severe acne to the point where I was almost hospitalized for a cyst on my back that was on my spinal column. And I had to quit because I couldn't get hit. So I couldn't get contact. So if people hit me in the chest, I'd just fall over in a ball, like in so much pain. So I had to stop martial arts for years and years and years. And then more recently, I was sort of looking for something new outside the powerlifting world and outside of the strength development world. And I basically found jiu-jitsu, and that's how I started. And it's genuinely become a love of mine. I try and roll sort of 5, 6, 7 times a week, and I've competed 3 times this year already. And I just competed in the state titles in New South Wales, and I was successful in that in the ultra heavy category. So, all of these things, it's generally something I'm going to stay with now for the rest of my life, even to the point where my lifting style has changed to meet the needs of jiu-jitsu rather than the actual barbell itself.
On that, what are some of the changes? Because I know with Liz, she's been training for maintenance now for 3 years, 4 years, something like that. But when she got into jiu-jitsu, it was the one thing that she noticed very quickly. She had to change her approach to volume, frequency, even exercise selection, just because of the niggles and the associated sort of wear and tear from jiu-jitsu. So how much has that changed for you?
Yeah. Oh, massively so. So one thing you learn very quickly on the mats is how much sagittal performance you have as a lifter. So everything's forward. And with my background in the barbell sports, it was even more so. Getting your arms above your head, for example, was just a laughable effect. So if someone puts you in a Kimura or an Americana, you just tap because you have zero flexibility in your shoulders. So I work a lot now. I'm a big fan of Phil Daru. If you're familiar with who Phil Daru is, he's an MMA coach over in the US. I do a lot of kettlebell things, a lot of kettlebell swings and sort of, coronal swings and things like that. A lot of lunges. I've changed a lot of my movements. I basically haven't done a barbell squat now in 18 months. Everything I do, I use a hack squat still, I use a pendulum squat, but most of what I do is lunges and RDLs and sort of single-legged sort of things with hip development. I've actually got a torn hip on my left side. So, I've got a pretty shitty hip as it is. So I've had to sort of really change the way I approach lifting anyway. And then using the shift across to BJJ has helped a lot in that regard, because it's helped me open up a whole world of, say, things that I maybe previously was a little bit arrogant to or didn't really see the value in for what I wanted to achieve.
And so you've seen that sort of shift in, I suppose, training modality as an opportunity to enhance your BJJ, as opposed to like seeing it as but I still want to lift and squat and all the rest of it.
Yes and no. I've come to it like, a lot of people, and this is, I don't mean to say this as a brag, it's more like an understanding conversation, but I've benched 5 plates aside, I've squatted 300, I've deadlifted over 300, all those numbers, which are always targets for a lot of people. I reach those. And so I have no desire to go heavier than that. When I was doing those numbers, walking up a flight of stairs for me was difficult. I was so unhealthy. I was high blood pressure, all of the things that come with the supplements that you take to get to those sorts of levels. So, and admittedly, I was taking those supplements naively. I wasn't doing it with any sort of, smarts about it either. So now I have this baseline, and every sort of 6 to 7 weeks, I just test my baseline. So if I can still put 160 on a bench, if I can still, pull 250, all these, I have these sort of levels that I like to sit at. As long as I can still meet those, I'm happy just being a higher volume guy, moving through the barbell and just being better in my mobility and my range of motion, and strength at end range basically is where I'll sort of go with.
And what about nutrition, mate? Has that changed too much? Or very different in regards to substrate availability or the way you set up your day with regards to that?
Yeah, a lot more carbs earlier in the day. For me personally, I used to be a sort of guy that trickled in carbs through the day, just really sporadically through the day. BJJ is, and I'm sure Liz can attest to this as well, it's very full on, but for a very short period of time. So, unless you're in a tournament or what's called an open mat situation, you don't have to sort of have the sideline carbohydrates or any endurance-based carbohydrates where you're coming in and getting a top up. Your glycogen stores are more than adequate to support, your 10 to 15 to 20 minutes of hard sparring on the mat. So provided my glycogen stores are full earlier in the day, I can go to training at 11 a.m. or 4 p.m. or 6 p.m., whatever the case may be, put a hard session in, come back, recover, get suitable, let's call them post-workout carbohydrates, and then I'm gold. So just the way I structure my day, the joke around some of the wider world of my sort of colleagues is that I'm the bagel guy. And weirdly enough, I never actually consume bagels much myself, but I've recently brought bagels in just to sort of, because they're easy, right? I have them with my eggs in the morning, have them with my chicken at lunchtime, and then I'm good.
They're also very diverse. Even, a cinnamon bagel with meat is delicious. It's also great with butter,
Yeah. There's a guy here. There's a guy here in Newcastle that does jalapeno and cheese with cream cheese spread, and it's fucking legit, man. And he makes it all himself. Makes the whole bagel himself too.
Well, man, I looked into potentially making my own bagels at one stage because I'm a bit of a foodie and I like to do those things. And then I realized that it was like a 2 or 3 day event, and I'm like, oh, hard pass on that. Thanks. Like, I'll pay $2. They're worth every bit of it,
Yeah, exactly right. But no, that's the biggest change, man, to be honest. And look, to be upfront with you, I've kept my protein very high. I sort of sit around the 320, 330 grams of protein, and on paper that's too much, but I just like being higher protein orientated. That's just where my world sort of sits. And one of the things we might even delve into today is research versus reality. What the research says versus how you actually apply it in real life. They're two often very different things, and sometimes we do get a bit stuck up on what the paper says versus what a person who's anecdotally learned over the years sort of says. And I just feel better at a higher protein levels, and also it also appeases my psychology as well. I'm from that background, and sometimes we do forget about the psychology of the client, and in this case I'm the client to myself as well. So little things like that make a big difference.
I wanted to talk about it at some point on the podcast. You might as well jump into it now. It's something I did want to bring up with the new research that's come out on recommended protein intakes being a lot lower than what we previously imagined. The nuance here I have a lot of conversations with clients that are seeing this, being a bit more advanced, and they come say, "Oh, should we drop my protein? Should we drop my protein?" Like, you're right in like 6 months into a really extended fat loss phase here. Like, maybe the 280 grams of protein I've got you on does serve a purpose here. Satiety, keeping you full. And I think, again, like you said there, with the nuance of this new data, like, people need to take experience and anecdotal reference as well as the knowledge in combination. Do you the higher protein diet would offer much more benefit for you outside of just, again, like you said, psychological reasoning?
Yeah, absolutely. Because there's a few reasons why. Like, going back to the point of the evidence, and you're referring to the new research saying 1.6, right? Is that the one you're talking about? Yeah. So that's sort of the latest sort of promotion is this: no need to go above 1.6, and at the very most 2. But the reality is again, that's on paper, right? Firstly, what the body fat percentage is that person sitting at currently, and what's their goal body fat percentage. So coming into a show, for example, you need to elevate that. In a lot of cases, especially in both of your worlds, you're working with people with super physiological levels of muscle mass. So that's another factor as well, which doesn't come into effect when they're testing 74 kilo collegiate aged athletes and all the sort of stuff they use in research. The young kid they're paying $50 to. What intensity is that person training to? What split are they doing? Are they doing a full body workout? Are they doing an arm session? A lot of these times they use that single leg extension type thing, and they test the MPS between the two limbs. And okay, is that the same thing if you spread it across the entire body's protein synthesis as well? But also, like you just said, there's things like satiety or comfort levels for the person. There's psychology of the person. Is that person got niggles and injuries? You have to worry about things like collagen restoration as well. Even Sports Dietetics Australia talks about the fact that you can go as high as 3 grams per kilo body weight if the person's injured, especially if the injury is acute. So again, you can't put numbers out like that because there are too many PubMed warriors on the internet who just run with shit, and they don't have any skin in the game. That's the first thing. But they're not dealing with people. People have belief systems. People have understandings. If a person like myself has a favor towards a higher protein, is it detrimental? When we know that the ISSN has said that nothing over 4.3 up to 4.3 grams per kilo is not going to do any damage. So are you okay with doing that? Is there some loose conversation around the thermic effect of food? Yeah, probably. There probably is some conversation there as well. I know Luke Lehman once said to me years ago that you can run somebody on super high protein and actually create a higher thermic response. It's minimal, but it's there if the person's really struggling with weight loss as well. There's a whole bunch of things like that which I think need to be taken into account as well when you're dealing with a fucking person and not a piece of paper.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's often missed that sort of evidence exists in the anecdotal, provided that it doesn't coincide with potential negatives or known negative side effects. That's the biggest thing I think people miss. Is that anecdotal evidence is evidence. It's just that we shouldn't be doing it or relying upon it if we for sure know that there's a problem. Like if, for example, this research said 5 grams of protein per kilo, to pick an arbitrary number, will absolutely cause X. And then we have a whole bunch of bodybuilders that are like, yeah, but 5 grams of protein's also made me jacked for the last 10 years. Like, evidence exists, but it also is existing in the presence of knowing that this is probably not so good for you.
Yeah, it comes back to this whole evidence-informed practice, right, as opposed to evidence-based practice. Evidence-informed practice must take into account the research, but it also must take into account clinical experience or clinical practice. But also, it also takes into account the client's anecdotal belief systems as well. Whereas evidence-based practice doesn't take into account those things. And so this is why we want to shift away from EBP to EIP. So it's really important we do make that shift, both in the S&C world as well as the clinical world as well.
Mm. Do you have any sort of, I suppose, go-to advice for somebody who is looking to at least box off protein as a sufficient towards that sort of like preferential? I'm not going to use the word optimal because, it obviously depends on the situation, for individuals that are looking for some protein guidance?
Yeah, if somebody falls short, I always have a baseline of 1.6. So anyone who's physically active should be baselining at 1.6. So for example, if I know that person hits 1.6 and for whatever myriad of reason of that day, they can't quite meet their needs, then those things happen. People live lives, etc. I always say, listen, hit the 1.6. Excuse me, and you're golden. You're most likely not going to lose anything, but you're going to put pause on the day, if that makes sense. You're going to hold your place. And I know that's a really basic way of explaining it, but that's an easy number for people to sit at. 1.6. If my 65-year-old female client says, hey, what do I have to hit? Well, you have to about 105 grams. Done.
Now, for smaller individuals like that, where it is 105 grams, do you have any preference then over protein feeding frequency?
I still try and go 4 times a day. I'm a big believer in 4 times a day. I know the evidence suggests around 3 times, but again, we're going back to the reality of life. One, is there a change after 3 times? Yes, there is. Is there a change after 5 or 6? Probably not. If a person's only consuming 105 to 120 grams, there's no reason to eat more than 3 to 4 times a day. But the reason, if we want to go back to the 3 to 4 times a day conversation, think of it like a spacing issue. You get up at 6 a.m., you consume breakfast at say 6:45 to 7 o'clock. You then eat lunch 4 to 5 hours later, and then you eat dinner 7 hours later. You can actually put something in. If you went from say 7 o'clock to 11 o'clock to 3 o'clock to 7 o'clock, you're creating that nice balanced sine wave. I'm sure you boys have seen that nice protein synthetic sine wave that exists that Stu Phillips always talks about. If we can create that really beautiful balanced wave, well, we're doing that with 4 servings per day, evenly spaced. We're not necessarily doing it with 6 or 7 servings per day. Also, as well, even on a larger person, take that same conversation to a larger person, the protein need per person is based on a gram per kilo. So it's around sort of 0.4 grams per kilo. So whilst the general consensus is, baseline of 0.24 grams per kilo, the reality is that's 2 variables. So we try and sort of sit at happy 0.4. But if that person's a little bit older, say above 35 years of age, we want to go 0.45 or 0.5, or if you want to go really crazy with training, it's 0.55. But you have to run those numbers to the person, then you split it down the middle into 4 sections. Go, this is what you consume 4 times. There's no need to do 7 or 8 meals unless the food volume is just so absolute. Like Dean, I know you were eating 1,000 grams of carbs at one stage, and you're not going to do that in 3 meals.
No, it's also going to take up a lot of protein. George and I were having a bit of a chuckle yesterday, actually, at my client, Michael Lucy, who just turned pro, and he requires a tremendous amount of food to sustain weight when he's been in a deficit and at very low body fat. It's astronomical. For reference, like the last 6 days, he's been at 1,400 grams of carbs, and then yesterday I had him at 1,650. And at 1650, he hit 350 protein, and only 180 of that came from direct sources.
Oh, it was all incidental.
Yeah, like rice, bagels, and like we said, what about crumpets? But he couldn't find crumpets in America at the time. They're a lower protein source, a higher carbohydrate option. Like, but yeah, it was crazy when you look at, like, it was a 4 meal sort of setup. There's about 30 to 40 grams of protein coming from an animal source within one singular meal, and then the rest of it was all coming from secondary. But
yeah, crumpets aren't a thing in the US, by the way. So crumpets don't exist in the US. So they're so go to flapjacks, which is basically what we call pancakes, or English muffins.
Yeah. It's just it's a really interesting topic of conversation, protein for varying size individuals, because you do come into these differences too when it comes to feeding. Just for clarity for those that are listening, we've mentioned a couple of numbers that I think may have just been thrown out without people recognizing what we're talking about here. You've got total protein per kilogram that we've talked about, which is that 1.6. So how many grams of protein per kilogram of body weight in a day being like an important number to recognize. And then you mentioned the 0.2s and the 0.4s and the 0.55s, and then we're talking about actual protein feeding per sitting.
Yeah. So that's exactly right. So when we talk about protein across a single day, we talk about a gram per kilo. So in that would be the case where we use the example of 1.6 up to about 2.2, which is the general range that most people talk. But as we discussed 10 minutes ago, that can expand right up to 3 grams per kilo depending on the individual needs. That's a given protein feeding across a certain day. So that's going to then be divided into actual protein individual feedings, and then and how you do that is you actually create this subsequent number, which is a dose of protein per meal time by using this 0.4 grams per kilo in the actual time. So if we use a really easy number like 100 grams, we would look at, all right, how do we divide that by how many feedings we wish to have? And then we times it by 0.4. So that's how we do it. That's how we figure out how much protein is required in that time. And again, just to open up, because I know I'll get scrutiny for this as well, the actual prescribed number at baseline is 0.24, but that's too low. If you look at the range of that, if you actually look at the graphics and you look at the individual participants in that study, that was just the mean average. There were quite a few participants in that study that sat at 0.4, 0.45, and 0.55. So let's go to the higher end, because you don't know what the person you're working with has the capacity to metabolize. All right. So let's go to the higher end, which is that 0.4.
Yeah. So from a hierarchy perspective, protein total for the day based on body weight, and then split it relatively evenly, but we're looking at roughly 0.4 per meal based on your body weight.
Yeah.
And then you're probably going to make up the incidentals.
Yeah. And then as a person ages, so above about 32 to 35 years of age, you want to move it up to about 0.5. And then above 40 years of age is 0.55.
And what about non-animal protein-based meals? Any variability in individuals that are following plant-based, or?
I'd be going straight to 2.2. If people are going through plant-based protein sources, or even incidental protein sources for that matter, that are sort of attached to a carb source, for example, like I mentioned the rice, I'd be going straight to 2.2 as a baseline, because of course the bioavailability of those is quite poor. And then from there, I'd also be looking at 0.5 or higher for those as well. Yeah. Cool. And that's generally from an amino acid spread.
And also to get a sufficient protein bolus per meal.
Well, yes, but the biggest thing is the bolus comes from the essential amino acid content of that particular protein, right? So you want to have a minimum of 8.6 grams of amino acids, of essential amino acids, and approximately 2.4 grams of leucine within that 8.6 grams of amino acids, and that's where it comes from. So provided you can meet that, but the problem with plant-based proteins is that isn't very high. So you may have 8.6 or 9.3 grams of essential amino acids, but the leucine content can be 1.1, 1.2, quite low. So the need to go higher is because of that inability to reach the leucine threshold, or leucine trigger. It's called usually leucine trigger in the UK, but it's called leucine threshold here in Australia.
Yeah, right. I was going to say I've never heard leucine trigger, but I like it because it's obviously stimulating a particular response.
Yeah.
Are there numbers for now? This is probably even well. I was going to say this would change a lot depending on substrate requirements for the athlete, but does this vary from athlete to athlete in protein in regards to, like, do you have a preference for the quantity of protein going in, whether it's 1.6 or 2.2? Is that sport dependent, individual dependent, calorie position dependent?
Yeah, absolutely. So Yeah, it's absolutely individual. So let's use the two which are sort of the widest apart would be something like an endurance athlete, for example, where the world, what George mentioned, the 1.6 to 1.8 is really as far as you need to go. And the main reason why is principally because, one, you don't want to have more protein at the cost of carbohydrates, which is what they actually need to perform as an endurance athlete. That's the first thing. Two, their synthetic rate of the synthetic protein rate is actually more aimed at mitochondrial protein synthesis as opposed to myofibril protein synthesis. So there's no need to have sort of this ridiculous amount of protein like you do in a bodybuilding world. And then, of course, we go to the other end of the spectrum, which would be something like a bodybuilder, for example, training 1 to 2 times a day, maybe using PEDs in some cases, for example. That's going to have a high nitrogen retention. They're going to be on the upper spectrum as well. They're going to be in the sort of the 2.2. And also, let's go into a deficit. That if their bodybuilder's in a deficit, as they get leaner, their protein has to go higher. So depending on the size of the person, on their musculature, all of these things, you would generally go 2.2 to 2.45, and then in extreme cases with superphysiological protein, as high as 2.8.
Yeah, cool. And
did that all make sense? Will your listeners understand that?
Look, we can only hope. The good thing about listeners is they can't actually ask us after the fact, you know. Or we can use it to generate questions on social media, you know. I think that's all pretty clear. I mean, this is the toughest thing with all of these discussions around nutrition and requirements and performance. It's always nuanced to the individual. There's always context. You know, I suppose that so long as we get the low-hanging fruit of people understanding there's a certain amount of protein required each day for the minimum effective dose up to, you know, let's say a maximum effective dose, and then there's a bit of wash over as well. I think people get that, and I think that the breaking down of the per meal sort of approach there is quite a good one, because it eradicates that conversation of people fearing that you can only, you know, utilize a certain amount of protein per meal, which somehow is sitting around in this world.
Well, firstly, on that one, you're not shooting out pieces of rib fillet, right? So that's the first thing. So you're using all the protein just for not maybe what the purpose you want to use it for in the first place. But back on the endurance thing is a really important one as well, because like I mentioned this really briefly, and I saw, George, you nodded your head when I said this, but it's super important when you look at the energy cost of the athlete in the chosen sport. How much are you eating? If they have a total energy need, how much are you eating into with each percentage of macronutrient that you're utilizing, right? So if a person is, you know, we use fats because fats are the easiest one to use as a percentage of total needs. So we don't want to drop below 20, or unless we're going to a really, really late stage of a prep, for example, we can drop below 20, or that person is somehow enhanced. But for the most part, we don't go below 20%. And then we have a baseline protein need. We have the residual carbohydrates that come from the rest of energy needs. We don't want to go too high on the protein, and for that matter, too high on the fats, because we're going to eat into the need or the ability for that person to access carbohydrates and time them correctly, because then you're going to go, all right, I still need to have a certain health parameter around this person as well. So if you're having to utilize, you know, X amount of carbohydrates, but then you have to worry about that person's underlying health as well, how much fiber is going to that day, because that fiber will take up a larger portion of the residual carbohydrates you're going to use towards that person. So favoring carbs for that endurance athlete is going to benefit the ratio of fiber to total carbs every day. You know, so even like, I know you were, Dean, I'm going to use you as an example. You were eating when you were performing last year or year before, you were eating Cocoa Puffs or something like that you're eating?
Some cereal variation, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, but the sheer amount you were eating, the fiber content of that would have been quite high.
Well, you know, actually, on that note, dude, I actually switched one of my cereals at that time to Chex, because Chex was such low fiber. Because when I was punching in 150 grams in a meal, it was on top of my vegetable requirements and macros and all that kind of stuff you try and hit, it was fucked.
Yeah. But that's the point, right? So no one at any stage would say Cocoa Pops or Cocoa Puffs is high fiber. Not a single person on the planet would agree with that or make that claim. But when you're eating so much of it, it is high fiber. It adds up. So when you've got an athlete who can't have high fiber intake, or for that matter, high fat intake coming into a run or coming into an event, you then have to go, all right, well, if I'm only giving them, let's say 300 grams of carbs as a you know, hypothetical sort of, you know, example, if we then have to meet 45 grams of fiber, well, we've got to put that somewhere, you know, and that's going to be attached to the carbohydrates we give them. And that's because you've chosen to give them 2.5 grams of protein. Whereas if you reduce them down to 1.8, carbs are protein sparing, but it means you can account for 360 grams of carbohydrates, for example. And that's going to allow you to get fiber outside of their need to train. Well, outside their peri-workout window.
Yeah, I loved, man, I think I remember listening to you use the term conditionally essential food choices. Whoa, I was on the Gold Coast. I don't know why that would smack me in the head, but I actually remember, I don't even know where I was walking where I heard that, but that is
do you mean
situationally dependent. You're right. I apologize.
Yeah.
I was there you go. It was far enough away that I remembered the concept. We got the wording wrong. But
Yeah.
I think that is a perfect representation. That is situationally dependent choices of food, relative to the individual and the time which you're going to give them.
Yeah. And that's exactly what we're talking about, right? The situation inappropriate conversation is based on the exact thing we just talked about. It's what's the situationally appropriate food for that time, and also how does it contribute to the total needs of the athlete? Because one thing Will Crozier said this to me, actually. He said, one thing you got to be concerned is like performance and health aren't the same, but you can't have performance without health first. So you have to have this framework, this foundation of health, and then you can build performance. What's happening too much now is you've got too many people trying to be performance based on fucking hash browns and Cocoa Pops. And it's like, no, you need to have this underlying foundation first. And that's where nutrients and fiber and all of these different comes into place. And then from there, you can build up, right? I love the saying, your input dictates your output. If you can't input things correctly, this is where nutrition comes in, but also it's where stress management comes in, sleep comes in, and all these different things, right? They're all inputs, which then predetermine how well we're going to output.
What are some of those low-hanging fruits, to use that word, for individuals that need to consider their health? Like, what about micronutrients for the benefit of an athlete outside of just general health?
Yeah, well, the big one, if we stay with sort of like more sports performance versus say like physique and aesthetics, definitely something like iron. So iron it's often thought about in the female world, but not often considered in the male world. And we have to remember that just the exertion over a given time of sport, especially in a person who's trying to be sort of a concurrent trainer, or let's call them a hybrid athlete as a determination, that's going to be a factor because that inhibits absorption. So just that gastric ischemia, the reduced blood flow to the GI tract is going to minimize the absorption of things like iron and copper and zinc and all these things. And iron is such an important oxygen carrier through the body as well. Then we've got things like zinc. Obviously, the obvious one everyone talks about now is vitamin D3 is a big factor too. We have to be careful with vitamin C. I had a client recently who was taking 4,000 milligrams of vitamin C, and I've had to pull him away from that. That wasn't my determination. That was pre-me. But I've just reduced him down to 500 milligrams. So little things like that. So be careful, not just what's coming in, but also the overconsumption of certain things as well. Things like, and going back to the vitamin D conversation, the Poliquin S days of 10,000 IU of vitamin D, those people still exist. Those people still exist taking that sort of sheer crazy dose of vitamin D3. Now, is that necessarily detrimental? Not really, but is it optimal? Not really either, because what's happening is your O25, your 25-OHD is converting to what's called 24-25-OHD, which is an inactive version of vitamin D, and that can't be then converted back to 21-25-OHD, which is the active version, right? So you're not utilizing it anyway. You're converting it to this inactive version of vitamin D, which means you're not getting shit.
And how much of this is supplemental for your guys versus nutritional?
Well, in England, all of it, because you got no fucking sun. But no, it depends on the person. It depends on where they are. So, I actually said to one of my professional athletes this morning, I said, hey man, how much sun are you getting? Because he was talking to me in essentially what is spring in the US, but he's wearing a long sleeve shirt. And I said, oh, how much sun are you getting at the moment? He goes, oh, get a bit of sun. He goes, I played golf 4 times this week. I said, cool, but what'd you wear? Well, I had pants on, a long sleeve shirt and a hat on. Well, you didn't get any sun. This perception versus reality. So this is where conversation comes in. This is why I don't do questionnaires. I talk to my clients through our video chat every single week, because that I can get more out of a conversation than I can never get out of a questionnaire. Right? If I said to this individual, how much sun did you get this week? Oh, well, I played golf 4 times a week. Cool. But a little bit deeper delving, and I've got a conversation. He was wearing the long sleeves. He had gloves on because he was playing golf. He had long pants on. He had shoes on. He had a hat on. He's driving a go-kart everywhere. A golf cart. Sorry, not a go-kart. A golf cart. So that's telling me, hey, he's getting no sun. It's perception because he's in the sun, but in reality, he's not getting anything. So we're still dosing him with vitamin D.
Yeah. And the other, like, how much, What about, so you mentioned obviously, I was going to say copper then, but iron before. Is this something that can be covered off from individuals from a nutritional perspective?
Most cases, yes. Typically with men, yes, unless there's some sort of absorption concern. Typically with females, in all cases, you want to get blood tests done, to be honest, because it's so individual. But in most cases with men, the need for iron is only around that 11 micrograms per day. So it's, sweet fuck all. With females, it's as high as 18 to 20. Now, if they're extreme trainers, it can go higher than that. So if a person has excessive amounts of exercise in their program, or they're just people who are just very active, it can go a little bit higher for men, a little bit higher for females. And this is where the importance of working with a quality doctor comes into play, because it's not that you're trying to step on the doctor's toes. And I really want to stress this, because there's this big belief in the fitness world that doctors are shit. Okay. It's not the case. Doctors see lenses, right? They're looking at it from things from a different lens. His lens or her lens is keeping you the fuck out of hospital. That's what they are. We call them general practitioners. Sometimes they're called primary care physicians, or first doctors. They're the doctors that keep you out of hospital. That's their role, right? As S&C coaches and performance nutritionists, we want to see people in their optimal state. Now, optimal being variable and sort of a bit of a niche word, but we're trying to make them the best version of themselves. So the doctors aren't shit. They're doing their job perfectly fine. In fact, in some cases, very, very well. But they're just not seeing it from the same argument you are. And that's the difference. Okay, so it's important that for what we do, you work with a doctor, not against the doctor.
Yeah, man. I found the transition from university to being a coach or working in the industry an interesting one, because at university they pushed this concept of allied health professionals so damn hard, and yet in practice, there was just always people butting heads with egotistical arguments.
Yeah. I mean, like there are some things, like, don't be wrong, you got, when I say work with the doctor, don't walk into a super clinic and speak to the first doctor who's bulk billed. Like, you've got to find a decent doctor to recommend your clients to. That's reality, because there are doctors who have, but there are coaches who are ego driven too, right? And I'm just trying not to shit on anyone's feelings, right? I'm trying to say, listen, hey, you've got to put the effort in to find somebody who you trust, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, a lot of my guys in Oz, GPs, again, like you said, they give the right advice, which is to keep them out of hospital. When we start diving into the realm where I specialize more in the advanced competitors, they are qualified to know this education. They've not gone and specialized in this medical degree, so we can't expect them to have the answers. They're going to give you, like you said, the answer to keep out of hospital, which is, let's just come off everything, mate, go back to a natural male. You're probably going to fix the problem. This is where we have to find the degree between like a sports doctor, someone who's a little bit more ahead, or even interested in that from a hobby perspective. You're going to get a lot more of a recognition just from their personal involvement in the sport that we do, or whatever it is that we're taking. So you really need to do your research and find someone. It doesn't just mean going to your local GP, or even on the health system. It usually means having to step outside of this and having to pay for a service to really get the right answer.
Yeah, and that's the beauty of things like iScreen and iMedical and places like that. There are these independent, and they do cost an arm and a leg, to be honest with you. They're way more expensive than they should be, but they do allow a client to get a test which isn't necessarily going to be not easily accessible via the way of a GP clinic. And the good news about, and more familiar with iScreen and iMedical, but iScreen have a doctor who'll give you like it's not a big report, but it's a mini report, and they give you that, and then from there you can infer where to go to. But look, and this is anecdotal, but I've always found younger male fit doctors tend to have a more open mind, and that's not me trying to be sexist. That's just my experience. If you find a young male doctor who tends to be fitter themselves, they tend to have a more open mind. And not so much, I mean, I'm based in Newcastle now, but previously in my hometown, we had a couple of young male doctors who would ask us questions and go, hey, what do you find with this sort of stuff? And then you'd say what you thought. Then, he would go and look it up and do the medical side of things and come back and then help you out with a lot of things. And it's that passion they have to learn things which fall outside of the general scope of their patients. That's that passion. Just like we have passion to learn more in what we do, they want to do the same thing. And that's where you need to sort of really dig deep and find the GPs that work best with you.
Yeah, I believe iMedical, for those that are listening, is similar in regards to getting a report. Should you wish, you can pay that sort of additional bit. You can also, I think, even book in a consultation with the doctor after receiving your results, should you wish to. But you can also just receive them via email within 24 to 48 hours, depending on what you're getting. You
have to specifically say in the UK, you don't want doctor's notes, because it's just a GP that's giving you the notes on the blood work. And it's usually a pain in the ass.
Right.
Done with you're clearly on enhancements. Let's just take them out. So it's better off not to have them in the UK.
Yeah, and you said cost, Phil. I had a client, I think, get an APOB the other day, and I think from memory it wasn't even that expensive. And then I saw on a forum in America, someone was asked to be charged $1,200 for an APOB.
Yeah, wow. Okay, right. That's insane.
But you know, public health systems are terrible. Why would you want one of those?
Yeah, I have a client who's very longevity obsessed as well, and that sounds negative, but I don't mean that. He actually makes me. He's actually a lovely guy, and I love working with him because he pushes me to learn about the tiny little nuanced things. And like, for example, obviously the APOB is the latest and greatest Peter Attia type thing, and he really pushes. Hey, what about my calcium score? And what about this and all of that? And I go, well, fuck, I haven't learned that stuff in years, so I got to go look in a little bit deeper and stuff. So it's always good to have those clients that push the envelope a little bit harder. But I think iMedical, it's 220. Sorry, iScreen, sorry, it's 220 for APOB test.
Yeah, you can get pretty comprehensive blood tests on iMedical, anywhere from as low as 140 through to about $300, like depending on how deep you want to go.
Yeah.
We gave some practical, I suppose, applications in regards to protein before. What about micronutrients? Do you have any sort of like low, sort of like barrier to entry, sort of minimum effective doses when it comes to fruits, vegetables, whatever it may be, or just general commentary around what people should be seeking from their daily nutrition?
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing to consider, and this is, I'll tangent off and I'll come back if that's okay with that answer. The first thing to remember is that when it comes to the guidelines of both the UK and Australia, the serving size of vegetables and the serving size of fruits are not the same. So the serving size of a fruit is about 140 to 160 grams, I believe, is the between the two countries that we're talking to now. And Australia, for a serving of vegetables, it's 75 grams is actually a serving of vegetables. So it's important we do differentiate those two things, because a lot of people sort of get mixed up in that realm. So personally, I always put out the fact that whatever the recommendations are, I try and double that. So it's always 130 to 140 grams of a mixed color. Now, I'm a big believer in what I call the toy train method. So the toy train method is, if you think of it like a toy train track, and you represent each plant source basically as a sleeper on the train track, what you want to do is have a train that takes up approximately 30 sleepers. And every month you just want to move the train 2 or 3 sleepers across. So basically every month you're picking up 2 new sleepers, losing 2 new sleepers, but the majority of what you're staying over stays the same. So this food rotation is really important. What happens, and this is probably more away from the micronutrient conversation, but I said I'll come back to that. It also exposes your gut to different fiber types and different things, so you become less reactive to food, and it reduces the chance of adverse effects around the time in which you need to have minimal GI discomfort. So that's a really important thing to point out as you set forward with that sort of stuff. When it comes to baseline, I know that the global recommendations for the Western world is 2 serves of fruit. I personally like 3 or approximately 400 grams of varying fruits per day. Now that's going to be, if you want to get technical, that's 2.65 servings of fruit per day. But let's just say 400 grams, right? Now that does change for larger males. If they're over 100 kilos, it's 500 grams. Now that's really a hit. It's not. You can smoothie in the morning. You cover that in one sitting. Okay. When it comes to vegetables, it's 600 grams. Okay. And the reason why I have a flat fee with that is because where I manipulate my fiber content is through grain. Okay. So that's why vegetables stay level. It's 4 servings at 150. And then I manipulate my fiber intake with different grains. So oats, for example, quinoa, etc. You see what's going.
Can I just poke you and tell you that people are going to say that grains are inflammatory, though?
They're not.
Such an insightful answer. To be honest, Phil, just quickly, I don't know if this happened to you, George, before, but Phil, you like broke up a little bit while you were going through some of that piece, and I was like, oh no, his internet's dropped. And then when I asked you that question, you just paused. I was like, fuck, it's happened again.
No, they're not. So look, they can be, but like, I know for a fact you boys are across this, but just for those who are listening, right? In most cases, people want to make that claim. They're talking about things that are generally demonized without the actual demon being present. So let's use gluten as an example of that, right? So gluten is this horrible, inflammatory sort of like protein source that exists within some grains. the reality is, in most cases, about 94% of cases, it's actually the FODMAPs which are causing the reaction, not the actual gluten itself. Now, FODMAPs are not as universal demon either. There's 6 different categories of FODMAPs, so we have to look at the 6 different categories. And then from that 6 different categories, which one is reactive to that individual? If it's mannitol, for example, or is it fructans, or is it disaccharides, there's all different things, right? So just because you react to onion doesn't mean that you're going to react to broccoli. So you have to sort of delineate which one's actually causing a reaction in a person. You do that via a elimination diet, then you slowly reintroduce the foods back in. But if people want to talk about grain being inflammatory, try spelt. Okay. The reason why is because spelt has gluten in it, but very little to no FODMAPs. So you can test people who want to talk about how bad gluten is with spelt, because once again, has gluten. In fact, more gluten than what oats do and what wheat does, but it has no FODMAPs. So if they have no reaction with spelt, the chances are they're probably reactive to one of the FODMAPs and not to the gluten itself.
This was exactly what I just did with my fiance. Exactly the same thing. Right
Okay.
about gluten for ages, and I kept telling her it wasn't gluten. It was most likely going to be a FODMAP of some kind, somewhere in the lines.
Yeah.
And so I tried the spelt, and it was.
Yeah, it was. And and actually, where I sort of dipped my toe in that test was many years ago. I worked with a couple, and the couple were a clean living type couple, no processed anything. They made all those ridiculous, raw treats, which are actually higher calorie than the real fucking thing, but it tastes worse. But that's a different argument for a different day. And they make raw Snickers, and you're like, just eat a fucking Snickers. It's half the calories and tastes better. But the point is that they were gluten free. And I said, oh, you got a lot of pasta in your tracker. Like, what do you use? I said, oh, we use spelt pasta. And then the wife got a phone call and she walked outside. And I said to the husband, spelt's got like a fuckload of gluten in it. He's like, no, it's gluten free. It's not. It's not. And he goes, oh, but we don't react to it. I said, it's because of the FODMAPs. And I explained it to him. And then from there, this is like 2017, 18. And then from there, I just use that as a test. So if people sort of want to talk about gluten, how they're inflammatory and stuff, I just use spelt pasta. And the best thing about spelt pasta is it tastes like pasta. So it's not even a change in the palate.
Ethical question for you then, Phil. Do you tell them that there's gluten in it?
Yes, because you're dipping your toe in some pretty, insurance-y issues if you don't. So yes, I absolutely do tell them there's gluten in it. But you're talking about the psychological aspect of it, like the potential psychological reaction. Yeah. No, you've got to tell them, man. You can't be that guy. Yeah.
Yeah, right, the placebo for as long as you can.
Because what if they have got a gen reaction and you just give them a fuckload of gluten deliberately? It's like, no, it doesn't work that way.
So it was your partner, it wasn't me.
No, you got to tell them.
Now, for we actually this is kind of a prescript thing. It must be, because we had Dr. Jackson on, and I asked him a similar question, in that there are going to be individuals out there that currently do not eat that many fruits and vegetables within their diet, and yet they will perceivably think that they are doing just fine. What do you say to individuals like that who fail to perhaps see the benefit of consuming more fruits and vegetables, and maybe like what are some of those benefits that we could educate them on?
They're working at 85% is what I generally say. They're working with a glass ceiling. This is no different to the keto conversation, right? People who are using keto or using, let's say, low vegetables and fruits, they're working at a perceptive reality of where they think they're at 100%. But as soon as you add those things back in again, I try and explain, hey, listen, this doorway opens, you've got this little extra space that you haven't quite accessed yet. That's how I see it. The without getting all nerd on you, I talk about what's called a Newton's bottleneck, okay, where you've got a lot of energy going in, but you haven't got enough things at the end of the channel in order to create more energy. So you're creating these roadblocks within themselves, because, whether it be the B group vitamins or maybe sort of the cofactors of the minerals that exist, for example, you haven't got enough factory workers to convert the fuel. So the analogy I like to use is, you've got a Ferrari that's full of fuel with no key to start the engine, is sort of the analogy that I use. So if I give you a Ferrari that's full of fuel, you go, fuck yeah, thanks, Phil, I really appreciate that. Oh, where's the key? No key. Just the car full of fuel. That's yours. Right. And I explain it in the most simplest terms, because that's how I see it. You are giving them all of this carbohydrate, all of this fat, all of this protein. But if they can't assimilate, if they can't, send T4 to deliver to turn to T3 to then detach to the back of the cell to create the mitochondria, metabolic activity of the cell, well, what's the point of having it? Yeah. If you can't create, you haven't got the amino acid chain to create insulin and glucagon in order to free up, glucose and all sort of stuff, what's the point of having it? So you need to have this ability to access the nutrients, access the fuel in the first place in order to create the energy you need. Like I said, glass ceiling, crack that door, you've got all of this space at the top you're not accessing.
Fair.
That's a pretty good analogy.
Yeah.
I try and keep it as simple as possible. Like I have this saying where know the complex to explain. So know the complex to teach the simple, right? So I use big words, but I try and use a big word then explain the big word. There's no point in me just going, oh, metabolic activity, just dribbling shit, because the person just says to me like, what the fuck did you just say? So as long as you understand that you're talking to people who may be, like you said, they're perceptually doing the right thing in their eyes. I don't need vegetables. I don't need fruit. Why not? What makes your body different to mine?
Yeah, it's I wonder if it gets lost in that the concept is that people just aren't aware of perhaps some of their sensitivities to, even just you mentioned before, just to draw that back, the FODMAPs, because there's this negative association with any kind of form of gas now being this precursor to what could be rabbit ears, quote unquote, qualified as bad gut health, when in actual fact we're just talking about potential fermentation or a shift in fermentation because of new exposure, which like so for, like you mentioned that the train stop before, which I really liked, and like the diversity and then working through it so that you got greater exposure, various different types of fibers for individuals who are currently consuming an otherwise fairly restrictive diet with regards to like diversity and that. How would you go about introducing food? Because, you also mentioned 500, 600 grams in regards to fruits and vegetables. Are we going from 0 to 100 in that Ferrari, or are we going from
never
jumping the Prius first,
Yeah. And if a person, so for those people who are in the fitness arena who do eat quite restrictively, and I'm not just taking a stab at the bodybuilding world, like just in the general athletically minded individuals who work in that aesthetic fitness arena, often you'll see it's broccoli or green beans, and that's pretty much what exists because it's cheap, it's cheerful, and it's available in the frozen section at Coles, right? So that's why they eat that same thing over and over again. But if I have a cat and a dog and only feed the dog, what happens to the cat? It's going to fucking die, right? So that's how your gut sort of works, right? If you have this, you have the different phyla of bacteria in the gut, and I only feed the Firmicutes and not the Bacteroidetes, not the Acinioproteins, whatever the case may be, eventually one's going to die off. So we need to make sure we introduce these things over time. And one of the things that you see a lot is people say, oh, just fermented foods, just chuck in some fermented foods. Well, that creates a negative environment initially first too. You get this big bloat and this heaviness and this GI discomfort. So I try and go in color spectrums. So if let's say a person's eating 75 grams of broccoli at lunch and 75 grams of broccoli at dinner time, I might bring in something that's going to be potentially low reactive, like a green bean is going to be low reactive, low FODMAPs. I might go, hey, listen, can you have 75 grams of broccoli and 50 grams of green bean, because they're already cut up in the frozen section and they're easy to add in. You can just add them in here and there. And then I'll go to something like a leafy green, for example. So you're looking at things which are low reactivity, and you add in the color spectrum. Think of it like the rainbow. The colors don't go from blue to purple. It graduates from blue into purple. So you do the same thing. You'll go dark, dark cruciferous into dark leafy, into light leafy, into say like a yellow, for example, into a red, and color, and move on like that. So you do it with a bit of tact. You can also fill the void with things like mushrooms, because mushrooms are typically low reactivity as well. And that's an easy way to get that person psychologically attached to different things as well.
Cool.
Unless you're like me with a shitty histamine response. Too many mushrooms gives me real bad.
Do you? Yeah.
I have to be very cautious on how many mushrooms I consume in a day.
Yeah, I mean, mushrooms are an example, right? But I if you go to you can even start on like low residue foods, for example. So mushrooms are one of the low residue foods, but zucchini is one. For that matter, a low serving of green beans is one as well. If long as you don't go above 75 grams of green beans, you can go, that's low residue. But a little bit of white onion, some green beans, some zucchini, some capsicums, so yellow capsicums versus say red capsicums, for example. And then obviously mushroom as well is a really easy one too.
I was going to say, it depends on what type of mushrooms you're talking about, George. But again, a topic for another time.
Yeah, but also as well, like don't also discount the fact of the temporary introduction of things like digestives as well. So Biogest, for example. So those things can also be beneficial too. But Dean, you made a really good point, right? Fermentation is normal. Okay, it's just some people tend to react to it, other people don't. Okay? So FODMAPs are either semi-digestible or not digestible at all, and they're only reactive to those who have sensitive walls. So if you don't have sensitive walls, fermentation, it happens. Yeah. Now, what happens a lot is we talk about, for example, the female menstrual cycle, which then obviously, slows peristalsis, it increases bolus buildup, which increases fermentation properly, and all of these things. And the thing about females is you've got such we talk about individualization when it comes to reactivity and protein needs. What about individualization around the menstrual cycle? It's massive, right? You have women who start seeing digestive change 2 weeks out at the start of luteal phase, not at the end, like some women feel, right? Some don't get it at all. So don't talk to the client and don't misunderstand what's what in the, who's who in the zoo, so to speak.
Yeah, I like that one.
Yeah. Who's who in the zoo? I like it.
Okay. I'm trying to keep it conversational, man, and not use big words and stuff like that. So I'm trying to keep it open for everyone to talk about.
And no, man, it's critically important that people have the opportunity. And the other thing too is like part of I think learning, you'll hear this quite frequently, is storytelling, and having a little caveat, little like nicks like this, where I'm like, oh, I remember that time that he said this, or what was that related to? And then it starts to draw back that whole memory. So I find it's just one that I hadn't heard before. So I found it just an interesting one.
Yeah. The other one is we mentioned fermented foods before as well. Like fermented foods are a really good one because you can use those too. But as I mentioned very briefly, be aware that if you go from this massive sort of restriction around vegetable and even for that matter, fruit choices, so it's just berries and broccoli, which you've been living on for the last 6 months, you've killed all the dogs, you've killed all of the diversity that exists within your guts. You've got pretty much a very small section of bacteria which you can survive on those 2 fiber types and make short chain fatty acids out of those 2 fiber types. So introducing like a fuckload of a bunch of kimchi or a bunch of sauerkraut, suddenly you're going to most likely have some GI distress. So start with a lower fermentation product, something like kefir. And if you really get sensitive, you can go like water kefir into milk kefir into yogurt kefir. So you can do it progressively. Then you can go into sauerkraut, which obviously the reason why you go sauerkraut over say kimchi is because of the spice, like the capsaicin that exists within kimchi. And then you can move into things like pickled stuff, like pickled carrots and, different things like that as well. Actually, you mentioned Dr. Dwayne. He is the fermentation guy. Like he's the guy. Fuck, he knows his shit about gut health.
Yeah.
Completely revamped my diet and approach to vegetables and fermented fruits and foods as well. Definitely.
Yeah. Yeah. Dr. Dwayne's the man with that sort of stuff. 100%.
Yeah. I think we've all probably done it where we've eaten too much of that stuff to begin with. And it's like, oh, well, there's a very quick representation of what you've done. And it's not the end of the world. You just need to modify that quantity,
Yeah.
I even find, I was actually quite surprised, Phil, when I first got to the UK of how, when I was in Australia, eating beetroot was almost always pickled out of a jar. That was the sort of go-to. Whereas here, the go-to is just typically cooked, steamed beetroot. And I remember when I first got here and I purchased it, I was like, what the fuck is this? Like, this tastes like nothing. And I was like, oh man, I didn't even realize like for a long time, I'd just been casually eating pickled like beetroot as an Australian with not even really picking up on the fact that it wasn't normal in other places.
Yeah.
I
had the exact same. Well, I had that exact experience very recently. A client messaged me from the US and he goes, how do I cook this beetroot, man? I was like, what do you mean? It's in a tin. He goes, no, I bought beets. I was like, oh shit.
Yeah, but the roots will attach.
Yeah. Because obviously we're so used to getting it in a container here.
Yeah, they're so bland in comparison too. Like it made me disappointed in a beetroot. I was like, beetroot on its own is pretty average, comparatively.
Yeah.
That's why we simple over here.
You mentioned just then too, Phil, that you could use something like you used a particular like type, I think, but like a digestive enzyme or an aid of some description. Where do you sit on that spectrum in regards to like utilization of them?
Yeah, I use them with clients at times. Not with every client. I think they're individual specific to the need. I've got a lady who uses them pretty regularly. She's very reactive to food, and we're still going through that process of finding out exactly what her concerns are. She's got a very heavy stress response when she has levels of stress. So we approach that carefully. So we're going through a process at the moment of working through her stress and writing up stress management techniques and things like that. So, but yeah, she's the only one I use them with regularly. But when it comes to people making that progression through their dietary need, I will always if needed, bring them in. And as I mentioned before, I use the Thorn Research Biogest. It tends to be the best one in my opinion. It is a little bit shorter on like things like Tudka. Like you want to add some Tudka to it, you can do that. I tend to use Tudka over like oxen bile. Sorry, dribbling my words just then. But I prefer that the Tudka be the fat washer versus say like an oxen bile as an alternative. But generally, Biogest for most people will cover its bases.
And more so as a point in time intervention.
Yeah. So it's generally going to be a progressive. So you don't really like, there are supplements which are staples, and let's say creatine is the example of that, right? It's pretty much universal, but there are some supplements you don't necessarily want a person to be on long term, or they shouldn't really have a reason to be on long term. Now, there are some medical reasons as to why a person would be on, a digestive gallbladder issues, for example, is one of those things, or some sort of stomach concern. But the reality is for a healthy individual, you can over time hopefully wean that person off those products. But yeah, generally, if there is a large jump from heavy restriction into moderate diversity into heavy diversity, there's going to be times where those products can be utilized.
Do you also find that, this is actually shifting way back, like do you find similarity in that you need to expose people to carbohydrates in a step-like fashion if they've been on something like keto or a low carbohydrate diet, or if coming out of a dieting phase whereby you're trying to reintroduce carbohydrates, whether it be for like the peaking process of a bodybuilder or just an individual trying to find performance improvements? Is that something you need to step them through as well?
Potentially, it changes the person, but even on a more acute position, right? So if you're the cut person for, say you've got somebody who's a 24-hour weigh-in for a powerlifting comp or a strong person comp or some sort of competition, they're doing a 24-hour weigh-in. If you go through if they've got quite a bit to drop and you pull carbs, excessively for a period of time in order to drop glycogen and fluids, if you try and rapidly restore glycogen or rapidly restore fluid too quickly, it can end up with a lot of GI discomfort. So that's obviously on an acute level, but if a person who's been delayed or without for such a long period of time, provided their peak week wasn't too crazy, you generally have to sort of introduce them over time. You can't go here 110 grams of carbs to 1,000 grams of carbs. They're going to end up all kinds of messed up. So I'm guessing you boys wouldn't do that anyway, but there are people who
sometimes you got a backload, sometimes you got a backload quite heavy.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm sure there are times. Yeah.
It's always the thing you're trying to avoid, though, for that exact reason. You don't want to be in that position most of the time.
Yeah, digestively aside, obviously that is one major consideration for an aesthetic. But is there anything mechanistically that people need to be aware of, Phil, that like whereby, fiber load, decreased capacity to uptake carbohydrates or even digest carbohydrates?
Yeah, potentially the decreased capacity. So if you've gone like long periods of time and the transporter of glucose is actually sodium dependent. So if you've gone for a long period of time and into a keto diet, and you've obviously your body starts to adapt, right? I call it firing the factory workers. So if you're a person who has gone keto for a long period of time and your body has fired the factory workers and shut down the factory to a greater extent, you need to build them up over time, because to the enzyme, without getting too technical, it's called SLGT1. So if you actually have diminished your production of that and then you load up a huge amount of carbohydrates, there isn't enough, carriers to carry it through the GI wall, and you're going to end up with a pretty heavy discomfort. So generally returning that over time is going to be the big thing. I'd probably suggest you see it more in like keto or extremely low carb diets, and you would see it in prep, because generally in prep, you've got that peak week and you've got a period of time where you are carb loading them and you've got carbs coming in and around their workouts. So you see it less in that regard and more in the keto change. So an example I use a lot is Zach Bitter. Zach Bitter is an indoor endurance. He's an ultra endurance athlete, and he actually primarily runs on a keto diet through the year. And then about 4 to 5 weeks out from an indoor endurance race, he'll actually start to load carbohydrates. Now, there's a couple of reasons why that's the case, because first thing is pyruvate dehydrogenase, which actually is part of the Krebs cycle that actually allows glucose to go into the Krebs cycle gets deactivated, and you need to turn that back on again. That takes about a week to do that. And then also he's got this downregulation inability to absorb carbohydrates. Now, if you're running 100 miles, which is 160 kilometers, you need carbohydrates through that race. If you can't assimilate that in through the gut wall during that race, you're going to be in all kinds of mischief when it comes to the actual event, not to mention the gastric ischemia we mentioned before, right? That poor blood flow, which occurs during those sorts of races. So if a person's gone without carbohydrates almost exclusively for a long period of time, you have to graduate them back in over time. And that could be just a return to normal nutritional intake, or it could be a return to an event basis, or it could be a return to, introduction of carbs in order to, to perform in a certain event.
Yeah,
that was
really
a big roundabout way of answering that, but hopefully that made sense.
No, I mean, I was hoping to push you in the direction in which you took it. So I'm glad, because the cool thing here is like there's this general conversation now we've had about FODMAPs, we've had about fiber, we've had about carbohydrates, is that there's enzymatic and mechanistic considerations that people have to think about. And it's not as simple as just turning the light switch on tomorrow, like you said, because there's so many factors to consider here, And dude, I'd probably argue, honestly, that there are individuals that would be on zero carbs outside of cruciferous vegetables in a prep for months on end. And then they get to peak week and they go, oh, carbohydrates are what muscles make them look good. So then they start loading carbohydrates in, and you take out the digestive stress that they experienced. You also then have the consideration you just mentioned there about like PhD and whatnot as well. So that's a really cool insight into carbohydrate metabolism.
And they also look like a giant water bottle because their body can't assimilate the carbohydrates correctly for about 4 days.
Yeah, that's the other thing too. You mentioned sodium, right? Could you talk about sodium and carbohydrates and the necessity for them to sort of work alongside each other?
Yeah, well, the short answer to that is to try and, as people say, there's no quick answer with me, but the short answer is basically in order to get glucose from the GI wall into the bloodstream, it requires a sodium transporter. And, we do this via active transport. So the body actually needs sodium there to do so. If you actually have little to no sodium, or you have a poor sodium uptake, you're then not going to be able to get enough glucose in at the right rate, which is 1.1 gram per minute is approximate capacity of an untrained athlete. And then from there you require the NAK pump in order for that to occur from the bloodstream into the cell as well. And obviously insulin's there too. So in the absence or in an overload of sodium, you're going to have this ionic charge which exists, which creates this high solute concentration in the blood, which means you look like a giant water bottle because nothing's going into the actual cell itself. And that takes about 96 hours to rectify itself.
Love this. As I had a note here, I was like, ask Phil about rate limiting carbohydrate uptake.
Yeah, well, this is actually a really interesting conversation, right? Because I've mentioned this a couple of times now, but glucose requires this SLGT1, this sodium like transporter in the GI wall, whereas fructose doesn't. So fructose actually has this passive transport of a capacity of about 0.65. So you can see instantaneously the glucose transits across the GI wall at about 2:1, right? It's not quite 2:1, but it's thereabouts. So people have this obsession with dextrose and glucose. When in actual fact, in an endurance-based environment or sort of a long duration-based environment, it makes sense to combine both glucose and fructose for a combined total uptake of about 1.75. Now that makes logical sense, right? And that's for many, many years, that was thought to be the capacity, 65 grams per hour for glucose and roughly about 30-ish grams per hour of fructose for a combined rate of about 90 grams. Now, what they found is you've got guys who do the Tour de France who are like, what the fuck are you talking about? We're doing like 90 grams of glucose an hour. And they're like, no, you're not. He's like, yeah, we are. Like, and it took them to say, no, we're actually doing this. This is happening in the real world on a daily basis. We're taking the absurd amounts of glucose for the researchers to go like, oh, maybe we need to look further into this. And they found outliers taking in 120 grams of carbs per hour combined between glucose and fructose. Now, that's an outlier because everyone is, nuanced and everyone is individual. And that's part of the prerequisites in order to be good at something like the Tour de France. You have to have certain underlying genetic factors like hematocrit levels and things like that. On top of that, the average person, what's called gut training, you start at about 20 grams per hour, 25, 30, 35, but you have to build that up. So we're not all just born with this ability to absorb 65 grams of glucose per hour. We have to train the gut to do that. And that's the body's upregulation of this production of this factory of this SLGT1.
And then there'd also be other competing or assisting considerations, I imagine, too, with macronutrient constituents of the actual food outside of carbohydrates.
Yeah, yeah. So things that change the GI. So there's gastric emptying, which is just from the stomach to the intestines, and there's intestinal transit, right? So they're two different things. So gastric transit, which is from the stomach to the GI, and then gastric transit. But the things which impact both of those are things like concentration, so which is the actual concentration. So sodium, potassium, magnesium. So how many minerals are in the constituents of the food. The caloric energetic density, so the caloric density of the food will actually change how fast it's absorbed, and then the composition of the food, so proteins, fats, and carbs. They're your three markers which will change the way food is taken and transited through the GI wall and up through the GI tract as well. So this is one of the reasons why I mentioned very briefly earlier, you don't want to go high fiber, high fat in peri-workout nutrition, because what's going to happen is you're going to inhibit that transit, because fiber, both weirdly enough, it both slows digestion passage as well as increases digestion passage. Okay, it does this to allow the bolus to move, but also does it to allow nutrients to be absorbed. So it increases the capacity for bolus to move, but inhibits it so nutrients can be absorbed. Well, if you've got dextrose coming in with psyllium husk, it's going to hold that dextrose back to a certain point, right? Fat does the same thing, because fat has to be scrubbed via the bile, broken down by the lipase, and then moved into micelles, and then absorbed through the lymphatic system, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So it slows that passage of the glucose going from the GI tract into the bloodstream.
And this is why people should get a coach. Because I mean, otherwise, right? Like, easy, Phil. I understand it all, mate. I'm just going to carbohydrate load myself now. I've got it nailed.
Yeah, well, the general rule is like, and this is where this goes back to the whole like paperwork versus reality, right? The general rule is don't exceed 10 grams of fat, don't exceed 10 grams of fiber peri-workout. But the reality is, if you're going 10 grams of fat and 10 grams of fiber, they're both technically within the threshold, but combined, they create more problems. So if you're having high fat and high fiber, try and go less than 5, less than 5. Don't go, oh, well, one's 9.5 and one's 9.5, therefore it's under 10. No, that's 19. Yeah, that's 19 grams of problems. That's what that is.
Yeah, that's 19, yeah. I've lost my train of thought of what I was going to ask then, just because of the 19 problems. But I think there's plenty of good content that's come out of this so far. Anything you want to unpick on this still, George?
No, I mean, the things that I wanted to cover, you kind of run through.
Yeah, it's not, you know what? It often is the case is I'll think about, like, what do I want to talk to this person about today? And then it'll either be like very much like that question that I'll have to ask, or it'll go completely in another direction because conversation just goes there. And in this instance, we just went for conversation and all the boxes got ticked.
Usually how it works.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
I rant a lot.
I wouldn't call it ranting, mate. You know, ranting would be like you there and then nobody else is listening. You know, like, are you actually here in the world, or are you just having an experience in 4 white walls thinking you're talking to 2 other gentlemen on the other side of the world? You know, we don't know.
I might wake up. Who knows?
I suppose, like, on the general concept of performance nutrition, being that is what we've spoken about today, we have a very, very, like, I suppose, how would you put it? Nice tagline and how to be less shit here on the Flex Success podcast, mate. If you were to give anyone a tip on how to be less shit, what would it be?
I'll bring in an Aristotle quote if you like. Any, and I'll paraphrase because it's sexist as fuck, but any person can do one action. It takes time and persistence to form it into a habit.
I like it.
Now that we've done the boring stuff, all the nutrition conversation, what is your favorite Greek myth that you've come through in this new endeavor you're chasing?
That's a good question, actually. I love the story of Medusa. It's a little bit pessimistic, but the reason why I love it is because there's actually multiple stories of Medusa, right? So the story, the version I like is that Medusa was born to, there's three sisters, and 2 were born as what's called gorgons, which is what we know Medusa to be, an evil, grotesque, witch-looking thing with snakes as hair. They're called gorgons. But she was born as this beautiful woman, and this woman who was just astoundingly beautiful, like challenged Aphrodite in how beautiful she was, right? And she was introduced to Aphrodite, and they were all chummy, chummy, chummy. And then her affection started to be seen from the men. And Aphrodite, who was this picturesque beauty, didn't like this. So she turned Medusa into a Gorgon, and the most hideous Gorgon to ever live. And that to me has shown people will always want you to do well, but never better than them. And it's a bit pessimistic, but I love that story. And yeah, so
the version of it I remember was Poseidon and Aphrodite were seeing each other as like a behind the scenes thing, behind her actual partner gods. Yeah. And because of the affair, she then turned Medusa into the Gorgon like the other sisters.
Yeah, yes, that's the gist of that's the central thing. So, but Poseidon was seen every motherfucker, right? So Poseidon and Zeus got their rocks off all over the world. But yeah, well, actually, on that note, like Poseidon, I love the actual fact Poseidon was the Zeus before Zeus, if that makes sense. You know, with the Mycenaeans and stuff like that, before Greek mythology was sort of Greek mythology. So I love that aspect of it too. But yeah, I just love that concept that there isn't. This is actually a good sort of segue. The reason I'm listening to and learning a lot of this Greek mythology is because I love the stories and the lessons that have existed for thousands of years that we still live by today. You know, I love, and if I use a more modernized version, Jordan Peterson does it a lot with the Bible. He'll talk about the Bible and the lessons from the Bible. And I thought, well, a lot of these stories, they coincide with all the different religions and all the different methodologies and the sort of the civilizations. And I basically was on YouTube, and it sounds real fucked up, but when I nap a lot during the day, I do what's called biphasic sleeping, where I nap through the day. I do these what's called internal productivity reports, and if I'm working at less than what I need to be 75%, I'll actually go for a nap, and I'll come back and I'll work at a high percentage. Therefore, I've lost time, but I haven't actually lost anything because I'll catch up with a higher productivity rate. That's sort of how I sort of work. But when I nap, I listen to this lady who tells murder stories, and her name's Bailey Sarian, and she tells these fucked up murder stories, and she does her makeup at the same time. No, I don't watch it. I just listen to it. And it's not the story. It's not the serial killer stories. It's her voice. Her voice is quite soothing. Anyway, she went MIA last year for a period of time, and she released no new videos. So I started to go down this YouTube rabbit hole with my headphones on, and I found Greek mythology, and I thought, you know what? This is actually really cool. Some of these stories are so informative and so, you know, detailed, and who's who in the zoo and what's doing what and who's talking to who and who's fucking who and all this sort of stuff. And, you know, and that's how I went, wow, there's a lesson there, there's a lesson there, and there's a lesson there, and there's a lesson there. And I've just taken it and run with it.
Yeah, the story of the Titans into the gods from Earth and the sky at the beginning, like it's just a constant betrayal from generation to generation of people.
Yeah, well, like the
top of the pile.
Well, even things like the primordials, like, so you obviously then, you know, Gaia made Uranus, Uranus, and then mated with Uranus to make the Titans, who then mated, and then he didn't like his kids, and he locked his kids up in the center of the earth, and it's this real fucked up story. And you're like, geez, this is a dysfunctional family.
How do you nap when you're so interested in the content?
It's got to be so it's quite funny. So when I started doing this, it's all to do with the sound, right? So even at nighttime, I nap to comedy. I nap to sitcoms. I don't use like brown noise or white noise, but it has to be sitcom I'm very familiar with. So I use a lot of like Modern Family. I use a lot of Seinfeld, shows that I've watched 1,000,007 times, because I have a very, very, very busy brain. So the sitcom, I can picture the episode in my head, and that puts me in like a dream state, and I nap, I fall away. And I was very lucky enough last year to work with a very successful Dubai-based businessman, you know, who's worth a lot of money. And I told him that story, and he said, oh, I do the same thing, but I listen. He's got a history degree, and he goes, I listen to historical podcasts. And I thought, oh, I'll try that too. And I listened to a documentary on Egypt, and I just sat and watched the whole fucking thing because I was so interested in it. So it didn't work. So it's got to be things you're really interested in. So it's got to be things which are mindless to you. But when it comes to the mythology and stuff, it's the voices. You got to choose a voice that you're comfortable with. If it's a really screechy voice or a voice which is not soothing, it doesn't work. You just stay awake.
Dude, that alone makes a massive difference to me, even in my ability to uptake information. Like audiobooks 100%. I struggle with because of the fact that it's just somebody talking at me as opposed to conversation. I'm very good at picking things up on. But I hate how many audiobooks. I really like when a person has it like self-narrates, right? Because I know that person's face. I can understand them. I know it's their voice. I understand what they're talking about. The talking voice that everybody has for those things is just mind-numbingly boring.
Yeah. One of the it's funny to mention that, because one of the books that I struggled to get through, which, and I want to caveat this by saying I love the book, but I struggled to read through it because his voice is so damn soothing, was Matthew McConaughey's book. I kept falling asleep because he's got this like Southern Texas drawl, and I was like, fucking boom, just dropped out because his voice is so damn soothing.
New nap book.
So yeah. Yeah.
While we're on, if you don't mind, and one more question just with regards to your biphasic napping. How long do you nap for? Is it predetermined, or is it like until you're ready?
It's absolutely predetermined. It's 25 minutes. So I'm going to sound so hypocritical here, but the research suggests that the perfect nap is 27 minutes. So I do 25 minutes. And it's so habitual now that I'll wake up at like 23 to 25 minutes. Like my body just wakes me up. It's that predetermined now in my psyche. The other thing is that if you do extend past about 30 minutes, you actually go into a sleep cycle and you wake up mid-cycle, and you can wake up with what's called sleep inertia, where you feel groggy. And if that's the case, I encourage you to go back for another 45 minutes. So it's either pretty much within 25 or more than 90. That's the rule.
Yeah. And is that 25 minutes of head on pillow, or 25 minutes you're trying to, like, how long does it take you to get out? Like that kind of, is it?
Yeah. So this is where habit comes into play. So for example, when I nap, I don't sleep. You're gonna think I'm weird as fuck now, right? So when I sleep at nighttime, I sleep on the bed, obviously next to my missus with a pillow.
Okay.
But when I nap in the daytime, I sleep transverse, and I always sleep at the foot of the bed, and I sleep with the one line of blanket across my midsection with no pillow. Okay. And I sleep with my hands above my head, and I drop out. And I sleep like that every single time, and non-negotiable, 23 minutes. I'm good.
Is this so that your hands go numb and wake you up at 25 minutes?
I've actually thought about that. I think that actually is part of it.
Yeah.
I think that actually is part of it. But I sleep with my hands above my head, with no pillow, and I always sleep transversely on the foot of the bed. And it works. The
blanket across the belly is the winner, mate. That's the winning method for sleep.
It's a blanket on the feet and legs.
Never on the feet and legs.
Feet have to go out.
I'd assume there's some kind
of
thermogenic regulation happening that's kind of
dictated. Well, yes, and it's also a predatory thing as well. It's also a predatory thing. So having a cover is a evolutionary thing about being away from the elements, so you're out of danger. But the feet thing is a thermoregulation thing. Yeah, absolutely. Feet, hands, and head have to be uncovered.
Yep, that's meant. Even in summer, I like to have a blanket just over my waist.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. We've got very high blood flow in our hands and feet and top of our head. And the thing about thermogenesis is we never gain cool, we always lose heat. So let's use an example of a cold compress, right? When you're sick and unwell and your mum used to put a cold compress on your head, you never put the cool of the compress into the scalp. It was always pulling the heat from the scalp into the compress. That's how it always works. So if you are having your feet and hands covered, you can't thermoregulate very well. This is one of the reasons why beanies work so tremendously well, right? Because they inhibit the ability for us to lose heat. So if you expose your hands and your feet, you have this higher blood flow in your hands that actually stops you from falling asleep and feel comfortable. Which is why when you're in an environment which is like kind of cold but not cold enough, you just put one leg out the blanket, it works. Yeah, that's the reason why.
All right, Phil, I'm going to go out on a limb here, potentially cost myself an argument in the household, but I may win one as well. So I'm willing to see what happens here. What is your opinion of, this is now sleep related, on whether or not it may or may not be, or indifferent, warmer to sleep with or without clothes under a blanket in the winter?
Oh yeah, I remember this conversation.
Can you say that again? So warmer.
So you're in the cold and you're going to sleep, and you obviously have to warm yourself up. Would you propose that it would be better to sleep without clothes under the blanket, or with clothes? Will clothes make you warmer than no clothes while sleeping?
I think personally, because you're covering the core, because the body regulates temperature from the core, right? So I'm trying to think out loud why this would be the case. Your body draws peripheral heat into the core and then redisperses it in order to control thermoregulation, right? So I think personally, I think for a more even spread, naked would be better. But I think from a warmer position, clothes would be better. If you want directly to be warm, clothes. If you want a better spread of thermic response, naked.
Okay. I reckon we're both listen. I'm probably like, we can argue either way. So I've heard people say that like it's better to sleep without clothes, never really being able to give me like a legitimate reason as to why. But my personal experience has been that I've always found it to be warmer under the blankets without clothes than with, because the movement I found when clothes get attached to the blanket and all the rest of it then create like a coolness of some description, and the blankets themselves actually don't get any warmth in them. So then you kind of like have a cold blanket over warm clothes.
What are you sleeping in Glad wrap? Like, what do you mean? Like,
so no, like if you're wearing clothes, right, and you said even before, like the clothes will pull the heat, will take the heat from the physique or from the body, but then the blanket itself doesn't really get any heat into it.
Like do you remember the old Riderwear shorts, like the really old torn bottom where they used to like stitch up, they used to tear them and then stitch the bottom up?
Yeah.
I have like 8 pairs of them. I sleep in them. I've had them. They're all holed up. Lassie doesn't work anymore. I put shoelaces in them for the tie. Like, I'll wear them. That's all I wear. My missus sleeps naked. She doesn't wear any clothes. She hates clothes when she sleeps. But
I'm a shorts only guy as well. Whereas Liz will wear full clothes. She prefers full clothes to sleep in. But I find it incredibly uncomfortable. But I also find that that my temperature regulation is maybe that's what it is that the temperature regulation under the sheets without clothes is more consistent. So it bothers me less. As opposed
that would be factual, because you said that from dispersion of heat, like the redispersion of heat would make more sense without clothes. 100%.
All right. I'm glad that we could not.
Good question, though, man. I genuinely don't know the answer to that, but I'm trying to think as logically as possible as to why that would be the case.
Well, that's what it was. I was like, maybe you can try and think about this on the spot and unpick it. Now, we've covered off all of the important stuff. The most important thing at the end of our podcast, as always, mate, is a would you rather.
Waiting for this. Yeah.
I'm not good at these, so I actually did a bit of research and I've come up with one. So, Phil, would you rather be alone for the rest of your life but have a positive impact on the world, or have meaningful relationships and friendships but have no impact?
Can I ask one more follow-up question?
Yeah, follow-up questions are encouraged.
Is the no impact neutral or negative?
No, I would say neutral. You leave the world without making any positive impact.
Oh, the latter. Having a good family and friends, but as long as the impact isn't negative, it's neutral. I'd rather have friends and family. But if it's a negative impact, I'd rather be alone and be positive. Fuck.
A lot of benefit from the latter in that situation.
Yeah, I mean, even the fact you'll live longer, that's probably the first thing.
Quality of life be perfect. Well, much better.
Yeah, I think people, even introverts, undervalue the impact a relationship can have, or meaningful relationship have, on your life and everybody else's lives for that matter too.
Yeah, I love my missus is as much as people don't think she is, because she dresses the way she dresses and she interacts the way she does socially. But a lot of people sort of tend to sort of challenge to see that she's an introvert 100%, but she calls herself an outgoing introvert, meaning that 4 or less people in a group she's solid with. She's no concern there, but anything more than that, she actually comes away physically exhausted from the experience. And me being quite conversational, quite open, and people recharge me, right? So I'm definitely I wouldn't call myself an extrovert, but I'm definitely leaning towards more that sort of space. We've been together for 7 years and I never understood it. And even now I struggle, but probably 5 years in before I really got the gist that people do genuinely exhaust her, but she still values that interaction so much. But then she needs a recovery period after the fact. So it's quite an interesting, having never had that myself, or never been around somebody who's sort of like reacts that way. It's been quite a challenge, but absolutely, she's a good experience of it. She's a good example of an introvert who still sees crazy amounts of value in people, but then needs that period of time to reboot. And yeah, the term she uses is an outgoing introvert.
Yeah. I would say I'm almost identical to that.
Yeah.
Unless put in a position whereby I'm comfortable and enjoyable, like, you know, standing in front of a group of people talking about this sort of stuff, highly energetic, weird, you know, like extroverted as you could possibly be, tell stories, don't care. But yeah, go into a party of people that I don't know and they don't know who I am or like anything about me. And I'm like, who's the one person that I can latch onto? You know, like Liz, don't leave me. Whereas Liz, I'm like, I walk into a party and I go, I brought her. And then off she goes. So. But Phil, mate, it's been a wonderful conversation. Very much appreciate you coming on the podcast. And for anyone that wants to find you, we'll put all the stuff in the show notes and whatnot. But where can people reach out to you should they want to just annoy you or maybe even seek your services?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that shout out. The best way to do it is just by Instagram. I'm very unusual in the sense I don't have a website, I don't advertise. There's no LinkedIn profile on my account. Just Instagram sport plus _ performance or _ Big Philly cheesesteak. 2 places to find me.
I love that Big Philly cheesesteak. Makes me want a sandwich.
Yeah, awesome guys. Cheers. Appreciate it. Cheers.